Hello and welcome to Legal Learning. My name is Mindy Jones with Coast to Coast Legal Aid. In honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, today we will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on mental health and resilience. I would like to introduce you to Tara Jongerson. She is the Chair and Associate Professor of the Department of Counseling at Nova Southeastern University. She completed her PhD in Counselor Education and Supervision at the University of Tennessee and her Master's of Education in Counseling at the University of Virginia. She is a Florida licensed mental health counselor and board certified clinical mental health counselor who has worked for close to 2 decades in both community and private sector mental health and addiction treatment. Her clinical work focused on individual and group counseling in community mental health, domestic violence shelters, substance abuse, private practice, and school settings. After completing her certification in critical incident stress management, she provided crisis and counseling services to community members and first responders in 2 deployments to Louisiana post-Hurricane Katrina. She has also responded to local emergencies, including the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shooting, as well as other fatalities. Since joining the faculty of the NSU College of Psychology in 2009, she has published on trauma, crisis, gender violence, group interventions, disaster mental health, and suicide, including a trauma-informed treatment manual for survivors of gender-based trauma called the Survivor Therapy Empowerment Program, or STEP. She has presented nationally and internationally on clinical topics, including mass shooting response, gender violence and suicide prevention. So we welcome you, Dr. Jongerson.
Thank you so much, Mindy, and thank you so much to Coast Legal Aid for having me today and for the invitation to speak to you all. So in the interest of time, I am going to have to skip my hilarious introductory joke that I had prepared to kick off my presentation. Because as we all know, 10 to 15 minutes is not a lot of time for professors who are used to hearing the sound of their own voice for about 3 hours at a time. So let's get right to it. So this is the first Mental Health Awareness Month post-COVID. And these are a few words that I never thought I would be including in a presentation related to coping, wellness, and resilience during this month here in 2021. But I know that we're all familiar with these terms. We know that attorneys particularly had to deal with specific stressors related to COVID, from learning new technology to working remotely without your hard copy files, to conducting hearings on Zoom. We all remember this "I'm not a cat" hearing pictured here on the slide. But as the pandemic continued, decisions had to be made on the work front about whether or not to meet clients in person, about how to handle unpaid bills when clients lost their employment. And then on the home front, you had to manage your own health. Perhaps you had family members who became ill and required care. You may have had children learning remotely at home, or had to share your home office space with a partner, other family members, or pets. So all of this, of course, took its toll and is taking its toll. But also as representatives of the justice system, as attorneys, you also had the competing stress of the extraordinary events that took place in our democracy in 2020 and in early 2021 with the Capitol insurrection, and also personally and professionally with the Black Lives Matter movement and those associated events. So I say that in the context that we can't ignore the compounding stressors that are accumulating or did accumulate on top of the COVID-19 stress in 2020 and 2021. So to kind of make that shift, and within that context, I'm going to frame my talk today and this topic of mental health and the pandemic within a paradigm that all of us, I think, can relate to here in the South Florida area. And that is the disaster mental health paradigm. Critical incidents and disasters are defined here on this slide. They are distressing, they are outside the usual realm of human experience, and they evoke fears of sincere threats to physical integrity. Now, I think everyone here is familiar with natural disasters. However, we also experience human-caused disasters. And human-caused disasters can be either intentional or due to human error. These disasters or critical incidents, they come typically without warning, such as a terrorist attack, or more locally here in South Florida, we had the FIU bridge collapse, the Stoneman Douglas and Fort Lauderdale airport mass shootings. And earlier this year, SAMHSA, which is the U.S. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they added this third category, which includes community unrest and infectious disease outbreaks. Now, what these have in common is not only the likelihood of the loss of life, but they also prompt evacuations and can overwhelm institutional resources. For example, when I'm responding to the Stoneman Douglas school zone in Parkland in the days after the massacre, my colleagues and I remarked that there were about 70,000 district absences out of about 271,000 students on the Friday after the shooting. So that's 26%. And some students and teachers never returned after that critical incident. So on this slide, I've listed some factors that impact recovery after a critical incident or disaster, and they're all relevant here. But I want to particularly focus on the perceived speed of rescue. So what does any of this have to do with COVID? Well, if we were in person right now in a room, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you think these factors are relevant to the pandemic. And my guess is that I would see several hands up in the air. However, COVID is not our typical critical incident or disaster experience. As we can see, this was the Lonely Planet's 2020 travel series. COVID is unlike the other critical incidents that we have survived, such as the Hurricane Irma evacuation. So let's examine how our prior disaster experiences can help mitigate the mental health issues both during and after COVID, and help to identify our resilience that we'll use in our careers and in our personal lives. So what we have here on the slide is the typical phases of a disaster, beginning with the warning. You know, people generally ignore warnings, right? Many of us here in Florida are highly familiar with the cone of uncertainty on the local weather forecast, and what are the spaghetti models showing, right? But then we move on to the alarm and impact. And that's when the threat becomes real. We make a personal risk assessment as we take inventory of the event that's coming our way when we realize it's happening. We kind of function on autopilot during this time. The next phase is after the event is when the rescue occurs. This is when we start to kind of come out of the fog of, oh, what just happened? Okay, did we survive? We enter this honeymoon period called the rescue phase. And this is where we see heroic efforts done by our neighbors, by our community. Unfortunately, though, that heroism wears off and gets replaced with anger, depression, and then ultimately disillusionment that things will ever be the same or go back to normal. And then right when we're in the height of our anger, our depression, our fear, finally, we see the cavalry come. During the recovery phase is when the professional help arrives. Help is readily available. There is hope. In a physical disaster, you'll see the Red Cross tents set up. You'll see command posts for law enforcement. You'll see medical providers. There's food available, temporary shelter. There are visible signs of relief and support. Somebody cares, and it shows. However, the recovery phase does not last indefinitely. After the crisis workers leave, the Red Cross moves out. The reality sets in that long-term reconstruction depends on the very community that has been devastated. Reconstruction is characterized by feelings of recuperation and eventually of healing. And it typically begins around the 1-year anniversary of the disaster. And it may continue for several years. We saw this firsthand in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. When I was first deployed 2 weeks after the hurricane hit in 2005, we saw communities in the rescue phase. We saw neighbors helping one another. They welcomed the mental health and medical providers with open arms. When I went back 6 months later, it was a very different landscape. People were exhausted, cynical, mistrusting, longing for their lives and friends and family members lost in the tragedy, and rightfully so. So which phase are we in here with COVID? Well, we really don't know. Unlike other disasters, a pandemic results in a complicated collective trauma with a nebulous end date. No wonder people are at risk to develop this sense of kind of hopelessness and despair. COVID is not contained within geopolitical borders. However, the communities will enter this reconstruction phase on very different timelines. I'm reminded of working in the Middle East in 2018, providing humanitarian mental health aid. And with the support of my colleagues in the university, we provided services to children and families who had experienced famine and violence and war atrocities. Now, our recovery models say, and our disaster models say, that they should be in the reconstruction phase this many years out. But there are complex and collective traumas that impede that process. And of course, COVID complicated it even more. So the mental health effects of COVID that listed here on the slide, they're going to be significant. We have a wave of needs headed our way related to mental health, addiction, and legal needs. And we need qualified behavioral health treatment providers and legal assistance and legal supports to support the communities that we work with. In our public schools, the COVID slide is real. Grades dropped, absences doubled and tripled. We're going to be seeing a rebuilding of that for a few years. We also have long haulers that are former COVID patients whose symptoms don't clear. Perhaps some depression, memory problems, fatigue, insomnia goes on. And this has implications for post-COVID assessment by not only medical and mental health providers, but also for those who will be representing these folks in court. We're seeing an increased need for addiction and court-ordered treatment that is evident from the economic fallout from COVID, and that continues, unfortunately, as crime also increases. And we're seeing a syndrome called post-COVID new onset psychosis. There's some studies published in Britain, Spain, and here in the US where we're seeing folks with no psychiatric history whatsoever develop hallucinations and paranoia, sometimes up to 6 months after the initial COVID diagnosis and after multiple negative tests. So we're going to be watching this one, especially for this, in addition to the ongoing neurological effects from COVID. But in linking this back to the disaster mental health model, these are some of the stressors that I think we've all dealt with globally within a relatively short period of time, not just in the legal profession, but in many professions and in many communities. And we also saw the effects not only from COVID, but from quarantine. As I'm sure you've witnessed this, not only in the legal community with your clients, but your other constituents that you run into in your circles. So what's the good news? Well, we see in this slide the Chinese symbol for crisis, which includes both danger and opportunity. And this has definitely given us both of those. With creativity, we have learned new skills. We have learned to cook, we've learned to purge, we've learned to renovate, build, maybe learned how to use Netflix for the first time. I've seen some good quarantini recipes out there as well. But we've also experienced an existential crisis. We've learned meaning, we've learned what's important, spending more time with family. Many even pursued career changes, maybe enrolled in school. We were also forced to be more intentional with our time. We take walks, we take breaks from the news, we are intentional about limiting our screen time, about how to combat Zoom fatigue. And mental health treatment, I think, has been redefined. We're delivering rehabilitative trauma-informed interventions both in person and via Zoom and telehealth. And while zooming into a virtual counseling session can be a little bit challenging, as I'm sure it is with your hearings and court, it can be challenging to recreate that setting of therapy via this video camera, but it's a skill worth developing. And you can probably imagine how difficult it is for, say, a sexual assault survivor to open up to her therapist about their experience in person, much less across a video camera. So we have ethical, legal, and safety concerns related to keeping folks safe when experiencing emotional crisis. And I am so proud of the mental health communities and providers that have really reached out and sought training of how to be more effectively reach and engage folks via this platform. So in closing, I want to kind of sum up that we need more accurate data collection and incidence rates about what is happening to our folks post-COVID. Many, including our own students, are unable to write and publish and report on what's going on actually on the ground because they're overwhelmed with clinical duties and playing catch up with kind of a backlog of things that kind of got put on the back burner through COVID. I think we're going to see an expansion of mental health services, including through technology. We're going to see public and private sector job growth, opportunities related to expanding mental health and addiction treatment. We're going to see an increase in court-ordered treatment, as well as more parity related to medical, mental health, and substance abuse treatment. The goal is to have this kind of one-stop shop for holistic wraparound services with medical, mental health, and legal to help foster healing and recovering after these critical incidents. So I hope this information is helpful for you. If you would like a copy of my slides or references for the information provided here today, I'd be happy to get those to you through Coast to Coast. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for watching, and thank you to Dr. Jongerson, and tune in on Thursdays at noon for more legal learning sessions with us. Join us next week for legal learning with our EACH unit, which is our economic advocacy and community health unit. Thank you.